Used to camp at this fairly secluded spot on state land. It has since been discovered and become popular, unfortunately. I've been going to that site since I was a kid, and it had become an annual tradition for my buddies and I to kind of unplug and rough it for a few days. However, at the time, a little over 15 years ago now, it was relatively unknown, and it was a bit of a trek to get to the campsite. Middle of the woods, but close to a lake, perfect for swimming. We're talking no cell signal, no light pollution, you're just out in the wilderness. My buddies and I were geeked to get out there and spend the week camping every summer. One summer afternoon, I'm the first to arrive, ready for a week of camping, drinking, and swimming. However, to my dismay, I discover that the site already has an established campsite going. There's a couple tents set up. Granted, it's a fairly large campsite, so I decide to haul my gear over and see if I can talk the other campers into letting us share the spot. Who knows? They might be cool and maybe it'll be one big party. I come up to the site and there's no people. The tents are empty. There was evidence of a campfire, so I know there were people here not too long ago. I decide to check the lake. Maybe they went swimming. There's a steep path that leads from the site to the lake, and as I'm walking alongside it, I discover some debris that has blown down along the path. There's a sleeping bag, some tools, and some clothes that had been on a line, but now they're all in the dirt. All evidence that this site has actually been set up for a while. The clothes are wet with ditch water. They've been sitting on the ground in the path for some time. There's no people at the lake, and when I return to the site upon further investigation, I discover that this site has been abandoned for some time. But that doesn't explain why they just left everything behind. From what I could tell, the people camping here had left in a big fucking hurry. There's clothes, there's food, and other gear. I mean, it's an entire camp. The tents were fairly new. I mean, it's not just stuff that you leave behind, unless you're scrambling and only grabbing the essentials. What was weird to me was that the fire was out, but there was still ice in their coolers and beers, so it couldn't have been too long ago that they were there. My other buddies arrive, and we decide to set up camp nearby and keep an eye on it. Maybe the people had to leave for an emergency or something. We wind up camping out the whole week, and no evidence of people coming back to retrieve their stuff. Luckily, the DNR happened to stop by on patrol, and we filled them in our discovery. They let us know they'd be packing up the stuff and take it into a lost and found up at their station. Kinda creepy, mostly weird. Who knows what happened to those people? Edit, I want to add that I did see evidence of little propane cans in the fire pit. Like those little cans that you use to light your camping stove. They were all burst open. We hypothesized that the campers were partying and tossed the canisters into the fire like drunk idiots, and one of them burst open. Somebody got hurt and they had to leave in a hurry.
You know, I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wild, surrounded by nothing but trees, stars, and the occasional rustling of leaves that's both thrilling and soothing. But this particular trip, I don't think I'll ever go camping again after that night. It started as most of our trips did. Me and my best friend Danny and two other friends, Rachel and Mike, decided to spend a weekend in the woods. We were all city kids, and this was our way of unwinding, disconnecting from the noise and reconnecting with nature. Danny found the spot online, a place called Shadow Lake, tucked away deep in a forest a few hours' drive from the city. The name alone gave me pause, but Danny was all about finding places off the beaten path. We got there late in the afternoon. The lake was beautiful, I'll give him that. The water was so still it looked like glass, and the surrounding trees were dense and towering, casting long shadows even in the daylight. There wasn't another soul in sight, and for a moment I was glad. We had the whole place to ourselves. We set up camp near the water's edge, pitched our tents, and got a fire going as the sun dipped below the horizon. The night was calm at first. We joked, laughed, and told stories while Rachel roasted marshmallows. Danny brought up the rumor he'd read online about the place being haunted, something about an old trapper who'd gone mad and disappeared into the woods, leaving behind whispers of his ghost. Rachel rolled her eyes. Typical ghost story, she said. Always some poor guy who went crazy in the woods. Boo-hoo. Mike, on the other hand, took it a little more seriously. I mean, places get their reputations for a reason, he muttered. You never know what's out there. That's when I noticed it, the silence. Usually, even in the woods, you hear something, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, or the rustling of animals. But there was nothing, just the crackling of our fire and the faint lapping of the lake against the shore. "Do you guys hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" Danny replied. "Exactly. It's too quiet." Rachel laughed. "Oh, come on. Don't start getting all paranoid on me." But the unease stuck with me. I tried to brush it off, joining the others in some stupid card game Danny had brought, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. And then the noises started. At first, it was subtle, a rustling in the trees just beyond the firelight. We all froze. Mike grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the sound. Nothing. Probably just an animal, he said, though he didn't sound convinced. The rustling came again, louder this time, circling our camp. "Yeah, that's not an animal," Danny muttered, grabbing the hatchet we'd used to chop firewood. Rachel tried to laugh it off, but it was clear she was spooked too. "Maybe it's a raccoon or something," she said, her voice wavering. Then came the whispering. It was faint, almost like the sound of the wind, but there were words in it, low, guttural, unintelligible words that sent a chill straight down my spine. Mike's face went pale. "That's not funny," he said, glaring at Danny, assuming he was playing a prank. "It's not me," Danny snapped, gripping the hatchet tighter. "Okay, everyone just calm down," I said, though I could feel my own panic rising. "Let's stick together," and that's when we heard it, a blood-curdling scream, piercing through the stillness of the night. It came from deeper in the woods, and it wasn't human. At least, I don't think it was. Rachel was the first to break. "We need to leave. Now!" But as we scrambled to gather our things, the fire flickered violently, as if hit by a gust of wind, and then went out completely. We were plunged into darkness. The whispers grew louder, surrounding us, and the rustling in the trees turned into full-on movement. Something was out there, circling us, watching us. Danny shone his flashlight toward the sound, and for a split second I saw it. A figure, tall, gaunt, and impossibly pale, its eyes glowing faintly in the light. And then it was gone, disappearing into the shadows faster than I could process. "Run!" Danny yelled, and we bolted. We didn't care where we were going. We just needed to get away. The whispers followed us, growing louder, turning into what I can only describe as a distorted, otherworldly growl. Rachel tripped, and as Mike and I helped her up, Danny stopped dead in his tracks. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Ahead of us, in the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, stood the figure. It was closer now, its features more distinct. Its eyes burned like embers, and its mouth, God, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, far wider than any human should. We turned and ran the other way, but no matter where we went, it was always ahead of us, waiting. It was as if the forest itself was leading us to it. By some miracle, we found the lake again. Our camp was in shambles, tents ripped open, belongings scattered. But we didn't stop. We grabbed what we could and piled into the car, not even bothering to pack properly. Danny floored it, and as we sped down the dirt road, I looked back one last time. It was standing at the edge of the trees, watching us, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. And as we rounded the bend, its grin widened, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. We didn't stop driving until we were back in the city. None of us said a word the entire ride. It wasn't until weeks later that I worked up the nerve to look up Shadow Lake again. What I found chilled me to the bone. The legend Danny had mentioned? It wasn't just about a trapper. Over the years, dozens of people had gone missing in those woods, their campsites found abandoned, much like ours. Locals spoke of a spirit, or a creature, that lured people in and never let them leave. We were lucky. We made it out. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers. And when I close my eyes, I see that grin. All right, look, I don't normally tell this story. Hell, I try to forget about it. But maybe it's time. Maybe you need to hear it. I'm not saying you'll believe me, but I promise you what happened. I'll never forget it. And trust me, you wouldn't want to either. Okay, let's rewind. 2 summers ago, a group of friends and I decided to go camping. Nothing fancy, just a weekend out in the woods. We found this spot, kind of off the grid, far enough from the usual camping crowds that we wouldn't be bothered. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend. Fresh air, campfire, beers, and maybe a couple of ghost stories. We drove out Friday afternoon, about an hour deep into the forest. We had a map, but honestly, we weren't too concerned about getting lost. We thought we knew the area. The plan was simple: set up camp, relax, tell stories, enjoy nature. Easy, right? Everything was fine at first. We were getting camp set up, the fire going, and just soaking in the peace. You know, the kind of quiet you can only get when you're out in the middle of nowhere. But that's when Mike, he's the type to always stir the pot, starts talking about how this forest had a dark history. He said it was known for, well, weird stuff. People had disappeared around there. Hikers mostly. Nothing concrete, just rumors. But Mike loved this kind of talk. He thought it was hilarious. The rest of us, we didn't really take him seriously. But what, right? So we're sitting around the fire, drinking beers, laughing, everything's normal. Then we hear it, a noise. At first I thought it was just the wind, but it came again. A thump. Heavy. Slow. Something was moving through the trees. Rachel, one of my friends, was the first to hear it clearly. She looked up, and you could see the worry on her face. She's like, "Did you hear that?" But we just shrugged it off. I mean, it had to be an animal, right? Maybe a deer or something. Nothing to worry about. But then it came again. Thump. Closer this time. At that point, we're all looking into the dark. And I swear to you, the air felt heavier. Almost like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt it too. Something wasn't right. We all just stayed quiet listening. Then we heard something else. A faint rustling, like something was moving around the edge of our camp. I told myself it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sound was too deliberate, too calculated. Eventually, we decided to check it out. I know, stupid, right? But none of us wanted to admit we were freaked out. So, we grab our flashlights and head out into the woods. Mike's leading the way, all cocky like he's some kind of expert, and I'm thinking, whatever, we'll figure this out. But as we went deeper, things started to feel off. The trees were thicker. It didn't feel like the forest we'd just been walking through. It was like it was changing. The air got stale somehow, like it was holding something back. And the noise? It was still there. That thumping, closer now. And that's when it happened. Mike, being Mike, decides to shout. He yells, "Is anyone out here?" Like that's gonna help. And then we all hear it. A voice. Not human. Low, guttural, like it was trying to speak, but the words didn't make any sense. We froze. It wasn't like any animal noise I've ever heard. It sounded wrong. The air around us went completely still. And that's when we saw it. A shadow, way taller than a man, moving between the trees. It was fast. Too fast. Almost like it wasn't even running. It just shifted. Now we're all freaking out. We turn and start heading back to camp fast. We don't look back, don't stop, just run like hell. And when we finally get to the camp, the fire's still burning, but something's different. The trees are closer. The path we took is gone. The forest has completely changed. There's no way out. I'll be honest, I didn't want to admit it at first, but we were lost. Totally, completely lost. And that thing? Whatever it wasn't gone. It was still out there. I could feel it. Watching. Waiting. We tried to leave, but every direction we went just led us back to camp. The same trees, the same path, the same dead silence. The thumping started again. Slow. Steady. And I swear it was circling us. Coming closer. Waiting. We spent the whole night huddled around the fire. No one spoke. We just sat there staring into the dark, listening to the thumping. Waiting. And in the morning, we couldn't leave. The path was still gone. The forest was still wrong. I don't know how to explain it. I really don't. But that forest? It wasn't like any forest I'd ever been in, and I don't think we were alone there. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan on it. Maybe you'll believe me. Maybe you won't. But I'll tell you one thing for sure. Whatever's in those woods, it's still out there. Trust me. You don't want to go there. It started like any other camping trip. I've been hiking and camping alone for years, so I thought I knew what I was doing. My plan was simple. Find a secluded spot deep in the woods, pitch my tent, and enjoy the quiet. No distractions. Just me, nature, and the stars. I wanted to experience true solitude. No other campers around for miles. What I didn't know was that I was walking straight into something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest around me started to change. The air grew heavier, thicker with humidity, and the forest sounds became quieter. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. But there was one noise that broke through, a faint, almost imperceptible rustling in the bushes. I figured it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a squirrel, so I brushed it off. But then the sound came again, closer this time. Not the familiar shuffle of forest animals, but something heavier, deliberate. I called out. Nothing. No response. I kept telling myself I was just overthinking things. I was alone in the woods at night. My imagination was running wild. But then it happened again. A loud rustling, and then a twig snapped. Now, it's easy to dismiss these things when you're surrounded by friends. But when you're out there, by yourself, your mind plays tricks on you. And that night, my mind wasn't playing tricks. It was just after midnight when the real terror began. I had gone to bed, trying to force myself to sleep. The fire was still smoldering, casting an eerie glow. I kept hearing noises, closer, faster now, almost like something was pacing around my tent. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it through the thin fabric of my tent, but nothing, absolutely nothing was there. Yet the sounds continued like they were coming from all around me. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl just outside the tent. It wasn't a bear or a wolf or anything I'd ever heard before. It was something different, something human. I froze. My heart was pounding in my chest. I could feel the weight of whatever was out there, watching me, waiting. I knew I had to act. I grabbed my survival knife and slowly unzipped the tent, trying to make as little noise as possible. And that's when I saw it, a shadow, a figure crouching low to the ground, moving between the trees. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with a hunchback and limbs that seemed to stretch too long. It wasn't human, at least not completely, but there was something about it that made my blood run cold. I couldn't believe my eyes. I was paralyzed, unable to move, but I knew I had to. I had to get out of there somehow. Somehow, I managed to gather the strength to zip the tent back up, heart racing. I knew that I couldn't stay there. I packed up everything in a frenzy, not caring about being quiet anymore. I just wanted to leave. But as I started to move away from the campsite, I saw it again, the figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. It didn't move. It didn't have to. I swear, it was like it was feeding off my fear. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, and I never looked back. I haven't been camping alone since that night, and I don't think I ever will. Whatever it was that I encountered out there, it wasn't just a trick of my mind. It was real, and it still feels like it's out there, watching, waiting. The scariest part? I know I'm not the only one who's had experiences like this. Imagine you're deep in the woods. The air is thick, the trees stretch high above you, and everything feels still. You're alone, far from the nearest trail, and there's a silence that feels unnatural. Suddenly, you hear something move in the darkness, but when you turn to look, there's nothing there. But you know, deep down, that you're not alone. You realize something's out there, watching you, waiting. This happened to me on a solo camping trip, and I'll never forget what happened next. What I encountered still keeps me up at night. It all started last summer. I'm someone who loves the outdoors, and I've gone on solo camping trips for years. It's my escape from the chaos of daily life. No phones, no distractions, just me, my tent, and the stars. So when I planned this trip, I was excited. I'd picked a spot far off the beaten path, miles from other hikers or campers. It was perfect, peaceful, secluded, and exactly what I needed to clear my mind. The hiking was long, but I was used to it. The woods were quiet, just the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional bird call overhead. The sun was beginning to set as I found a small clearing by a stream, and I decided it was the perfect place to set up camp. I pitched my tent, built a small fire, and settled in. There was no one around for miles, just me and the wilderness. But as the evening turned to night, things began to feel off. As the fire crackled and the sky darkened, I noticed something strange. The usual forest sounds seemed to vanish. No more birds, no more rustling leaves, no more insects buzzing in the air. It was dead quiet. The only sound left was the soft crackle of the fire, and even that seemed distant. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I shrugged it off. After all, it was just my mind playing tricks on me, right? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees around me. Every time I looked into the shadows, it felt like something was moving just beyond my sight. But when I turned, nothing was there. I laughed at myself, chalking it up to the isolation. Maybe I was just on edge. It was late, and I figured I should get some sleep. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to ignore the creeping sense of unease that clung to me. I was exhausted from the hike, so I closed my eyes and tried to drift off. But every time I was about to fall asleep, I'd hear something, an unnatural rustling in the trees. Not the usual noises of animals or the wind. This was deliberate, like something was moving, carefully, quietly. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone in the woods. Maybe I was just hearing things, right? But then, I heard something unmistakable, footsteps. Slow, measured, definitely human, or at least humanoid. My heart started racing. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The footsteps came closer, and then they stopped. I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible, waiting for the next sound, the next clue. But there was nothing, just silence. Then the footsteps resumed, but now they were right outside my tent. My mind was screaming at me to stay calm, to stay still, but I couldn't move. My hand was on my knife, the only protection I had. The footsteps circled my tent. I could hear them shifting on the ground, moving closer and then farther away, as though whatever it was studying me. After what felt like an eternity, they stopped. I didn't hear anything else for a long time. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I debated whether or not I should go outside and investigate. But deep down, I knew I couldn't do that. Not with whatever that was out there. Eventually, the noises stopped. I didn't hear anything for what felt like hours. I couldn't tell if I'd fallen asleep or if I had just passed out from exhaustion. But the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sound I'll never forget. Bang! A loud bang. A rock or something heavy hit the side of my tent. I shot up, adrenaline flooding my veins. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight, but before I could even reach it, another rock hit, this time on the other side of the tent. And then, something worse happened. A low, guttural growl, so deep, so primal, that it sent chills straight through my body. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a bear or a wolf. It sounded like something human, and it was close. Really close. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced through every possible scenario, but none of them made sense. Was it another camper playing a prank? No way. This felt too real, too dangerous. My gut told me that whatever was out there wasn't human. It didn't belong in these woods. But I couldn't bring myself to move. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, the only thing keeping me from going insane with fear. The growl came again, louder this time, almost as if it was right outside my tent, breathing on the other side of the fabric. Time seemed to slow down. My mind was racing, but my body refused to move. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I just lay there, holding my breath, praying whatever it was would go away. Then the growl stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was waiting for me to make a move. I finally gathered enough courage to unzip the tent just a little bit, shining my flashlight outside. I thought I saw something move in the shadows, something tall, something wrong. A figure, hunched over, its limbs longer than they should be, moving with unnatural speed. I couldn't tell if it was human or something else entirely, but I knew that I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay any longer. Whatever was out there wasn't something I could fight. It was something far worse than I could have imagined. I grabbed my bag, shoved everything inside, and started running. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every step I took, I felt like it was getting closer, closer, until the hair on the back of my neck stood up. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I didn't care. I just had to get to my car. I ran through the forest in complete darkness, only the light of my flashlight guiding me, and every crackling twig underfoot felt like a warning. When I finally reached the trailhead, I couldn't get to my car fast enough. I didn't care about being quiet. I didn't care about anything. I just needed to be safe. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, doors locked, engine roaring to life. I drove as fast as I could, not even looking in the rearview mirror, terrified that if I did, I'd see that thing in the woods following me. I haven't camped alone since that night. I don't think I ever will. Whatever it was in those woods, it wasn't just a trick of the mind. It was real, and I know deep down that it's still out there, waiting for someone else to wander too far, to stay too long, just like I did. I was never much of a camper. I didn't see the point in it, honestly. I like my bed, my electricity, and the comfort of a good cup of coffee without having to boil water over a campfire. But when my friends begged me to join them on a weekend trip up to the woods near Lake Harlow, I relented. It was one of those rare occasions where they wore me down with their enthusiasm, and I thought, how bad could it be? We were a group of 5. Me, Tom, Sarah, Mike, and Jess. We'd rented a cabin. Nothing too fancy, just a little place tucked deep into the forest where you had to drive for miles to get there, away from any other signs of civilization. To be honest, that's what worried me the most. The isolation. It wasn't like we were in the middle of a national park or some popular camping spot where there were other people around. No, this place was remote. Too remote. It was late autumn, just before the first snow of the season. So the air was crisp and the trees were bare, their skeletal branches creaking in the wind. The sky was overcast when we drove up, which didn't help my mood. There was something eerie about the way the fog hung over the lake, like it was hiding something. We didn't waste any time unloading our gear. Tom had this ridiculous idea of having a bonfire, even though we all knew it was probably against the rules. But we didn't care. No one was around to stop us, and the warmth would be nice. It wasn't long before night fell, and we were sitting around the fire, beers in hand, laughing and telling stories. The fire crackled and popped, casting eerie shadows against the trees. Jess had started telling one of her creepy stories about some woman who went missing in the woods a decade ago. I wasn't paying much attention, more focused on the warmth of the fire and the way the flames flickered, but I remember the mention of whispers in the trees. As the night wore on, the conversation drifted. Tom told us about a time he'd gone camping alone and heard something moving around his tent, but he just chalked it up to animals. Mike, who always tried to lighten the mood, made a joke about the ghosts of the lake, but no one laughed. That's when I felt it, the sudden, uncomfortable silence that seemed to fall over all of us. The wind had stopped, and the air grew thick. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Anyone else hear that? Mike asked, his voice low. I froze. It was barely a whisper, like the wind carrying a murmur through the trees. It wasn't a gust. It wasn't the trees groaning. No, it was more like words. Soft, faint, but distinct. Shuh, I hissed, my eyes darting toward the dark woods. Everyone else seemed to notice it too, their heads turning in sync, straining to hear the noise. At first, it sounded like someone calling out in the distance, but the words were too jumbled to make out. I thought I heard something too, Sarah said, her voice shaky. Probably just animals, Jess offered, trying to sound brave. But I wasn't convinced. I knew what I had heard. The wind picked up again, and the sound faded into the trees. It was as if the forest itself had exhaled and then gone silent. Too silent. Well, let's head inside, Tom suggested after a few awkward moments. It's getting late. We all agreed, though none of us wanted to be the first to leave the fire. I felt a strange sense of unease, as if someone was waiting for us in the dark. But we made our way back to the cabin. The inside of the cabin didn't feel much better. The wooden walls creaked as we moved, and the low hum of the fridge in the corner did little to drown out the discomfort in the air. We made ourselves comfortable around the fireplace inside, but the unease remained. Mike suggested we play cards, but no one really had the heart for it. Hours passed, and just as we were starting to feel the heaviness of sleep creeping in, we heard it again. The whispering. This time it was much closer. It wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from outside the cabin. Did you hear that? Sarah whispered, her face pale. We all stood up, straining our ears. The whispering was constant now, like someone murmuring just beyond the door. Not a voice we recognized. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was as if someone was trying to speak, but we couldn't make out the words. Tom grabbed the flashlight. Stay here, he said. I'll check it out. No, Tom, Jess protested. That's a bad idea. But he was already at the door, swinging it open. The beam of the flashlight swept across the porch, the yard, the tree line, but it illuminated nothing but empty space. Nothing out here, he muttered, and started to step back inside. Then it happened. Just as he was about to close the door, something reached out from the darkness, just beyond the light. Something large. A shape. It was too fast, too unexpected. Tom screamed, a guttural, desperate sound, and slammed the door shut with a force that rattled the entire cabin. What the hell was that? Mike shouted, backing away. We all crowded around Tom, who was panting and shaking. His face was pale, his eyes wide. Something grabbed me. It was cold like ice. Are you sure? Jess asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, but something was out there. It didn't look like an animal. It was too big, and there was something wrong with the way it moved, like it was gliding. For a moment, no one said anything. We all just stood there in the silence, listening. The whispering was gone now, replaced by the sound of the wind, but that only seemed to make the air thicker. I think we need to leave, Sarah said, her voice low. Now! Tom didn't argue. Neither did anyone else. We grabbed our things, moving quickly, but as we gathered in the small entryway, the lights flickered. Then the cabin was plunged into darkness. Great, Mike muttered. This is just perfect. Let's go, Tom said urgently, grabbing his flashlight again. We'll head to the car. The walk back to the vehicle felt like an eternity. The forest seemed to close in on us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, just out of sight. Every rustling branch, every snap of a twig, made us jump. We made it to the car, but just as we were about to open the doors, we heard it, the whispering, louder now, surrounding us from all directions. It was then that I saw it, a figure. No, a shape, standing just beyond the edge of the light. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could explain. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, glowed faintly, like two pinpricks of light in the dark. Get in the car! I screamed. We didn't hesitate. We piled into the car, slamming the doors behind us. The engine roared to life, and Tom floored it, speeding away from the cabin. But as we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with us, watching us from the woods, following us through the trees, its whispers just on the edge of hearing. I don't know what it was out there, or why it came for us, but I know one thing for sure. I'm never going camping again. The whispering? I still hear it sometimes. It calls my name in the middle of the night, and every time, I'm too afraid to answer. Have you ever felt like something was watching you when you were out in the wilderness? That nagging sensation that claws at the back of your mind? Imagine you're miles from the nearest trail, alone in a dense forest, and then you hear something, a noise that doesn't belong. But when you look, there's nothing there. Or is there? What I experienced on a solo camping trip will make you question whether we're really ever alone in the woods. It was the summer of 2021, and I decided to go on a solo camping trip to clear my head. I was tired of the daily grind and wanted a few days of peace, just me and nature. I found a secluded spot in the mountains, away from the usual hiking paths. The perfect place to disconnect. I packed up my gear, grabbed my backpack, and set off early one morning. The first couple of hours were peaceful. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the only thing I could hear was the crunch of dirt under my boots. I finally reached my campsite by late afternoon. A small clearing nestled between a few large pines, with a stream running nearby. It was perfect, the kind of spot that made me feel like I was a part of the wilderness, a world away from everything. I set up my tent and a small campfire. It was an ideal setting, peaceful, remote, and beautiful. As the day faded into evening, I cooked my dinner and sat by the fire, enjoying the solitude. The woods around me were quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of animals rustling through the underbrush, the wind in the trees, it was all gone. It was just the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the stream. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it was there, gnawing at me. I told myself it was just my imagination. I had been alone for hours and hadn't seen a single person. The night fell, and with it came the silence. That's when it started. I first heard the rustling in the bushes just beyond the light of my campfire. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, something small. But then it happened again, closer this time. The leaves crunching, the branches snapping. I got up from my seat and shined my flashlight in the direction of the noise. Nothing. No movement. No animal. Just darkness. I didn't think much of it. After all, animals are unpredictable, right? I told myself it was just a curious critter. But then the rustling came again. This time, it was much louder, closer. I grabbed a stick and waved it around, trying to scare off whatever animal was getting too close. But the noise stopped instantly. No movement, just the deep, unnatural silence that had settled over the forest. I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know you're not alone, but you can't explain why you feel that way. I decided to call it a night and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly. I knew I wasn't going to sleep easily. The noise had unsettled me. For the next hour or so, I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the silence. And then it came again, footsteps slow and deliberate, moving around the perimeter of my tent. They circled me, each step growing louder as they came closer. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. My heart was pounding in my chest. I kept my flashlight by my side, but I couldn't bring myself to shine it outside. I was frozen. I didn't know if it was an animal, or worse, if it was a person. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear my own heartbeat in the dead silence. I held my breath, waiting for whatever was out there to move again. But nothing happened. No more footsteps. Just complete stillness. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was probably just an animal, maybe a coyote or a mountain lion, and I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something off. My instincts were screaming at me to stay quiet, to stay still, but every fiber of my being wanted to grab my things and run. The next few minutes felt like hours. I don't know how long I lay there in the dark, waiting for the sound to come again, but it didn't. Eventually, I heard a distant howl, a coyote, I thought. It was far away, but it was enough to snap me out of my panic. The silence in the woods returned. After a while, I managed to fall into a fitful sleep, but I kept waking up, my heart racing, sure that something was out there. The rustling never stopped in my mind, even though I couldn't hear it. I woke up early the next morning, exhausted but relieved to find everything still intact. The air was crisp, and the birds were starting to sing again. I thought I was being silly, overreacting to a few strange noises. But when I looked around my campsite, my stomach dropped. There were footprints, not animal tracks, but human-sized prints, barefoot with long, elongated toes, right around my tent. They weren't there the night before. They couldn't have been. I would have seen them when I first set up camp. My stomach churned. I knew that I wasn't alone in the woods. Whoever had been outside my tent wasn't just some curious animal. This was something far more unsettling. I quickly packed up my camp, trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. I wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. I knew the woods were vast, and I had no idea how far this person, or thing, could be, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. As I began my hike back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me. Every step I took, I felt eyes on me. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I half expected to see something in the trees watching me. But when I turned around, there was nothing, just the empty forest. Yet the feeling of being pursued never left. I quickened my pace, pushing myself to get back to the car as quickly as possible. But as the hours dragged on, the feeling only intensified. I started running, my breathing heavy, my legs aching, but I couldn't stop. I had to get out. When I finally reached the parking lot, I didn't even bother to look around. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and drove off without a second thought. I didn't care about the views or the beauty of the landscape anymore. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as I could. I haven't camped alone since that day. I don't think I ever will. Whatever was out there in the woods, whatever left those footprints, it wasn't something I want to encounter again. I've heard other campers talk about strange experiences like mine, about feeling like they weren't alone, but I never believed them. Now I know better, and I'll never forget the footsteps that circled my tent, or the feeling that something was watching me, because I'm convinced that thing is still out there. It was early October when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the deep woods. I needed to escape from everything, work, relationships, the constant noise of life, and find some peace. I picked a spot in the middle of a national forest, miles away from the nearest road. No cell service, no distractions, just me, my tent, and a few days of solitude. I arrived in the afternoon. The weather was crisp but not too cold, perfect for camping. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. The air was thick with the earthy smell of pine and damp leaves. As I walked to my chosen campsite, I couldn't help but feel a sense of calm wash over me. I wasn't scared. I was prepared. A seasoned camper, I'd done this alone countless times before. I'd hiked some of the most remote places in the country, so this should have been just another trip. The site I chose was in a secluded area near a creek, surrounded by dense woods. There were no other campers around, which was exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and settled in to enjoy a quiet evening. As the night fell, the forest around me became alive with the sounds of crickets and distant owls. It was peaceful, maybe too peaceful. As the fire crackled, I began to hear something faint in the distance. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but then the sound grew louder, almost rhythmic. A low thud, then another. My mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. Maybe a bear was nearby, sniffing around the campsite. But then the sound changed. It wasn't the sound of something heavy moving. It was lighter, more like footsteps. Human footsteps. I told myself it was nothing. Probably just another hiker passing through the area, maybe someone else setting up camp a few miles away. But the footsteps kept coming, steady and deliberate. They weren't random. They weren't animals. They were human footsteps. Someone or something was walking toward me. But there was no trail, no path around my campsite. No one else should have been here. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it in every direction, but the forest was still. No movement. The footsteps had stopped. I stood up, my heart racing, and strained my ears to hear any more sound. But there was nothing. The only thing I could hear now was the sound of my own breathing. After a few minutes, I convinced myself that it was probably just a deer or some other animal, and I went back to my seat by the fire. But the feeling of unease lingered, that nagging sensation that I wasn't alone. Nightfall fully settled in. The sky was clear, the stars visible through the gaps in the tree canopy. It was breathtaking, beautiful, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I ate a quick dinner, cleaned up my campsite, and decided to turn in early. I thought I'd sleep through the night and be refreshed in the morning for a long hike. I climbed into my sleeping bag, zipping up the tent and trying to shake the lingering unease. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, the woods are full of sounds that are hard to explain. It could have been a bear, a raccoon, or even the wind. But then it happened again. Soft, deliberate footsteps outside my tent. Closer this time, not just one or two steps, but several, moving slowly around the perimeter of my tent. I lay there, completely still, hoping whatever it was would just go away. My mind was racing. My hands gripped the flashlight and my pocket knife, but I didn't dare move. I couldn't make a sound. The footsteps circled my tent, slowly, and then stopped. Silence again. I thought about what to do. Should I confront whatever it was? Should I call out? But what if it was something dangerous? Or worse, what if it was a person who shouldn't be out here at all? Then I heard something worse. A whisper. So soft, so low, that I wasn't even sure I had heard it at first. But it came again, just outside the tent. A single word, almost like a question. Hello? My heart skipped a beat. I didn't respond. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My mind was racing, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there, but I couldn't make myself move. The whisper came again, a little louder this time. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The voice was so calm, so casual, it almost didn't feel real. It was like someone was just waiting for a response. I didn't know if it was a person who had lost their way or someone who had been watching me for hours, but I knew one thing for sure. Whoever was out there, they were not a hiker, and they were not someone I wanted to meet. I couldn't just stay in the tent. I needed to leave. I wasn't about to confront whoever was out there. But when I unzipped the tent to leave, the figure I saw made my blood run cold. Standing just at the edge of the firelight was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket and a hat. He didn't look like he was wearing hiking gear. No backpack, no camping supplies, nothing. And worst of all, he was just standing there, staring at me. His face was hidden by the shadows, but I could see his eyes glinting in the light. He was watching me, waiting. Everything inside me told me to run, but I couldn't. I just froze. The man didn't say anything. He didn't move. It was like time had stopped. For a long moment, we just stood there locked in this silent standoff. Then, without saying a word, he turned around and walked away. Slowly, deliberately, like he knew exactly what he was doing. I couldn't believe it. I just stared at the spot where he had been, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stay another second. I grabbed my things, threw everything in my backpack, and bolted. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I just ran, through the trees, over the uneven ground, not stopping until I reached my car. When I got there, I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove off, leaving the campsite and whatever had been out there far behind me. I haven't camped alone since that night, and I don't think I ever will. Whatever that man or thing was, it wasn't supposed to be there. I still can't shake the image of him standing just outside my tent, waiting, watching. And every time I think about it, I wonder, what would have happened if I had answered him? What if I had stepped outside that tent? Was he waiting for me to make a move? Or was I just lucky that he left when he did? It was the summer of 2019, and I had just graduated from college. I'd been itching for a solo camping trip, and after some research, I decided to head to Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming. It's one of the most famous parks in the U.S., known for its rugged mountains, pristine lakes, and expansive wilderness. It's also known for its incredible camping sites. I reserved a spot at the Jenny Lake Campground, one of the most popular sites in the park. Sure, it gets busy, but I thought, what better place to enjoy the beauty of the outdoors? Plus, it's safe, well-maintained, and right next to some great hiking trails. What could possibly go wrong? The drive up to the park was beautiful. The towering peaks of the Teton Range loomed on the horizon as I made my way through the valleys. When I arrived at Jenny Lake, the sun was just beginning to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I could already hear people laughing around the campfire, kids playing, and families gathering. It felt like the kind of peaceful, picturesque campground you see in travel brochures. I quickly checked in, got my campsite number, and began to set up my tent. Everything was going smoothly. I unpacked, built a small fire, and began cooking some dinner. Around me, the campsite was bustling with families and other campers, but the atmosphere felt relaxed. It was exactly what I had been hoping for. However, as the sun disappeared and the campfire flickered, something started to feel a little strange. The sounds from the other campers began to fade. The wind kicked up a little, but it wasn't enough to explain the strange silence that seemed to fall over the campground. I stood up from my camp chair, looking around. The forest around me was dense with tall pines, and although I could see a few other campers, the space between them felt much larger than I expected. It was almost like I was alone in the middle of a busy campsite. At first, I brushed it off as me being tired, but then I heard something. It wasn't the sound of wind or animals. It was the faintest of footsteps, almost like someone was walking along the trail near my campsite. But when I glanced over, I didn't see anyone. I assumed it was just someone taking a late-night stroll. After all, this was a popular campsite, so it didn't seem strange. But then the footsteps came closer, too close. I could hear them clearly now. Someone walking, almost deliberately, around my tent. I didn't panic at first. It could have been another camper, right? But what unsettled me was that I didn't hear any voices. No excuse me or sorry to bother you. It was just the sound of someone walking, slowly, as if they were testing the ground with each step, carefully moving just outside my tent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed my flashlight, but something told me not to turn it on just yet. For a long time, the footsteps circled my tent, around and around, slow and steady, like someone was deliberately trying to remain unseen. I could feel the tension building in my chest. This wasn't normal. Even though the campground was crowded, I hadn't seen anyone walking around since the sun set. I didn't hear anyone else's voices, just silence and footsteps. I don't know why I didn't call out. I couldn't bring myself to. The only sound I made was my shallow breathing. I stayed as still as I could, just listening. The footsteps came closer. They stopped right outside the entrance of my tent. I swear, I could hear someone breathing. A low, almost inaudible sound, but there, right outside the zipper. I lay there, motionless, wondering if I was being paranoid. Maybe it was an animal? Maybe a person had just gotten lost, and they were circling my tent by mistake? But the more I listened, the more I realized this wasn't an accident. Someone was standing there, deliberately. Then the most unsettling thing happened. I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. Not a whisper, but a low murmur. A male voice saying, "I know you're in there." It was enough to freeze my blood in my veins. I held my breath. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but I knew I couldn't make a sound. I wasn't sure if this person was hostile or if they just had bad intentions. But I knew one thing for sure. I was not dealing with an innocent camper. For what felt like an eternity, I stayed motionless. Every second stretched on forever, my mind racing with all the possibilities. I wondered if this person was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. The voice came again, softer this time, almost like a lullaby. "I know you're in there. Don't make me come in." I could hear the rustling of fabric against the tent fabric. It was like they were kneeling down, getting closer, maybe peeking inside. I thought about running, but then I realized if I ran, I'd be a target. If I screamed, the whole campground would hear. But what if no one was close enough to help? What if this person had been waiting for someone like me to show up? Someone camping alone? The voice stopped, and there was a long silence. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't see anything through the fabric of the tent, but I could feel that someone was still out there. My mind raced. I couldn't just stay in the tent and wait for something to happen. I had to get out of there. I waited for a few more minutes, listening intently for any sound. When I finally felt brave enough, I slowly unzipped the door of my tent, as quietly as I could. I peeked out, scanning the area with my flashlight, but I saw nothing. The campsite, which had seemed so busy just hours ago, was now eerily quiet. There was no one in sight. I couldn't even hear the wind rustling the trees anymore. Everything was still. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my gear, packed everything up, and began to walk back toward the main entrance of the campground. The whole way there, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still following me, that someone was just out of view. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I half expected to see a figure standing there, watching me. By the time I reached my car, I didn't feel safe anymore. I didn't feel like I could stay at that campsite another second. I didn't even lock my car. I started the engine and sped out of the campground, the headlights cutting through the darkness, my hands still trembling. The further I drove, the more I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Someone or something had been out there, and I was sure I wasn't just imagining it. I've never been back to Grand Teton National Park since that night. No matter how many times I think about it, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Someone was out there, watching me, waiting for the right moment. But the worst part? I never saw their face. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps. And I'll never forget the voice that said, "I know you're in there." You know how when you're out in nature, you feel like everything is calm, peaceful, and under control? You set up camp, light a fire, and think, this is exactly what I needed. But sometimes that illusion of safety can shatter in an instant. Imagine you're camping alone in one of the most famous parks in the country, Yosemite National Park, and you suddenly realize you're not alone out there. Something or someone seems to be lurking in the shadows. This is the terrifying experience I had one night, and I still can't shake it. It was early June, and I had decided to take a solo camping trip to Yosemite. The idea was simple: disconnect from everything for a few days, sleep under the stars, and hike some of the park's legendary trails. Yosemite is known for its towering cliffs, ancient trees, and breathtaking waterfalls. It's a place millions of people visit every year, and most of them have an incredible experience. So, I figured there was nothing to worry about. I reserved a spot at the North Pines campground, one of the most popular and well-maintained campgrounds in the park. It was surrounded by towering pines and right next to the Merced River. Perfect. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the granite cliffs. The campground was buzzing with families, friends, and other solo campers. I could hear laughter, the clink of camp cookware, and the occasional bark of a dog. The sounds of the river were peaceful, and the air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine and earth. I set up my tent, arranged my gear, and sat down to enjoy the evening. As the sun set, the campground grew quieter. People started retreating into their tents, and the sounds of nature began to fill the air. I lit a small fire and heated up some food, enjoying the tranquility. It was everything I wanted: peaceful, beautiful, and serene. But just as the stars started to appear in the sky, something changed. At first, it was subtle. The rustling of leaves in the distance. No big deal, right? Maybe a raccoon or some other animal was nearby. I didn't think much of it. But then I started hearing something else: footsteps. Not the random scurrying of wildlife, but deliberate, slow human footsteps. And they weren't far away. They seemed to be moving closer, taking one step after another in a rhythmic pattern, just out of my line of sight. I glanced around the campsite. Nothing. There was no one near me. Now, I've been camping enough times to know that in places like Yosemite, animals are the most likely culprits for strange sounds. But this felt different. The steps were too calculated, too precise. It wasn't like an animal wandering about. And there were no voices, no calls, no laughter, just the steady crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. I told myself it was probably another camper, maybe someone out for a late-night walk. But still, something about it didn't sit right. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything went quiet. I waited, straining my ears to hear anything. But there was nothing. No rustling. No sound of an animal moving in the bushes. The silence felt oppressive, like the air itself had become thick. But then I heard something even stranger: whispers. Soft, unintelligible murmurs coming from the darkness. They weren't loud, but they were there. Close enough for me to hear, but not close enough for me to see anything. My heart began to race. My instincts were telling me to pack up and leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being paralyzed. I didn't know what to do. You know how when you're out in nature, you feel like everything is calm, peaceful, and under control? You set up camp, light a fire, and think, this is exactly what I needed. But sometimes, that illusion of safety can shatter in an instant. Imagine you're camping alone in one of the most famous parks in the country, Yosemite National Park, and you suddenly realize you're not alone out there. Something or someone seems to be lurking in the shadows. This is the terrifying experience I had one night, and I still can't shake it. It was early June, and I had decided to take a solo camping trip to Yosemite. The idea was simple: disconnect from everything for a few days, sleep under the stars, and hike some of the park's legendary trails. Yosemite is known for its towering cliffs, ancient trees, and breathtaking waterfalls. It's a place millions of people visit every year, and most of them have an incredible experience. So, I figured there was nothing to worry about. I reserved a spot at the North Pines campground, one of the most popular and well-maintained campgrounds in the park. It was surrounded by towering pines and right next to the Merced River. Perfect. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the granite cliffs. The campground was buzzing with families, friends, and other solo campers. I could hear laughter, the clink of camp cookware, and the occasional bark of a dog. The sounds of the river were peaceful, and the air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine and earth. I set up my tent, arranged my gear, and sat down to enjoy the evening. As the sun set, the campground grew quieter. People started retreating into their tents, and the sounds of nature began to fill the air. I lit a small fire and heated up some food, enjoying the tranquility. It was everything I wanted: peaceful, beautiful, and serene. But just as the stars started to appear in the sky, something changed. At first, it was subtle. The rustling of leaves in the distance, no big deal, right? Maybe a raccoon or some other animal was nearby. I didn't think much of it. But then I started hearing something else: footsteps. Not the random scurrying of wildlife, but deliberate, slow, human footsteps. And they weren't far away. They seemed to be moving closer, taking one step after another in a rhythmic pattern, just out of my line of sight. I glanced around the campsite. Nothing. There was no one near me. Now, I've been camping enough times to know that in places like Yosemite, animals are the most likely culprits for strange sounds. But this felt different. The steps were too calculated, too precise. It wasn't like an animal wandering about. And there were no voices, no calls, no laughter, just the steady crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. I told myself it was probably another camper, maybe someone out for a late night walk. But still, something about it didn't sit right. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything went quiet. I waited, straining my ears to hear anything. But there was nothing. No rustling. No sound of an animal moving in the bushes. The silence felt oppressive, like the air itself had become thick. But then I heard something even stranger: whispers. Soft, unintelligible murmurs coming from the darkness. They weren't loud, but they were there. Close enough for me to hear, but not close enough for me to see anything. My heart began to race. My instincts were telling me to pack up and leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being paralyzed. I didn't know what to do. I stayed still, my eyes scanning the shadows beyond the firelight. The whispers came again, this time a little louder. It was as if someone was standing just outside my campsite, talking in hushed tones, trying to be discreet. But I knew I wasn't hearing things. These weren't animal sounds. It was definitely human voices. My mind raced with possibilities. What if it was another camper, maybe someone who got lost?